Hey, Chelsea Jensen here. I'm going to talk about progressive image loading today. Before I get started on that, I want to briefly touch on image optimization because that is the very first step to progressive image loading. This is just a review. If you want more details, you can always go to our class in Canvas and go to the Student Resources tab. There's a module there called Image Optimization, and there's a lot of really great information, as well as a tutorial that kind of walks you through a lot of this. Basically, what I want to touch on is some tools that you can use for image optimization. There's Adobe Photoshop, GIMP, Pixlr Express, and there's also tinypng.com, which offers a Photoshop plugin. This website, I just want to show you really fast, is a great source to compress your images. Basically, what they do is they cut down the number of colors that your file is saved with, but you really can't tell a difference. So here's the original over here on the left side, and their compressed image on the right. It's more than 70% reduced in size, and yet the image quality is pretty much the same. It's pretty impressive. They have a plugin for Photoshop, so you can actually use it within Photoshop, which is a nice feature. So if you're interested in that, check it out. But moving on to actual progressive image loading. Basically, progressive image loading is allowing a placeholder to take the place of where your image will load. And then we transition to the nice original picture once it's actually loaded. It cuts down on the original load size when pulling up a website, and helps everything render a lot faster. I have an example here of progressive versus non-progressive image loading, just to give you an idea of what the difference looks like. We have on the left-hand side of this video, the left-hand side, we have a non-progressive image load. And on the right-hand side, we have a progressive image load. Now, the non-progressive is going to load top to bottom, and the progressive is going to show the whole picture and slowly come into focus. We'll go ahead and watch that. And I don't know about you, but for me, I really like the progressive image load. It's nice to have a general idea of what this picture is before it's completely loaded. On the non-progressive image, it's kind of frustrating. It makes you feel so impatient, or at least it does me. I want to know what else is in that image. And so a progressive image load really enhances user experience. Typically, our internet connections are not so slow that it's going to take a full minute for our images to load. But if you have a really slow connection, this non-progressive image load can be very, very frustrating. So that is progressive image loading. And one of the main parts of progressive image loading is what we call placeholders. There are different kinds of placeholders that we can use. There are just solid background colors. Google uses this really well. And a lot of times, well, what they do is they choose a color that matches with the image that will go in that place. So they're not choosing like a neon green to go with some pink roses, or, they do something that is similar, and it enhances the user experience. It makes it look more fluid as it transitions. Another type of placeholder is a low quality image placeholder. These are a great solution when you have a lot of images that need to load, and it works best when you're able to put those images in line, the placeholder images in line. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. This is probably, well, this is the type of placeholder that I will show you a code pen for. It works very well and it's easy to replicate. There's also an image SVG trace where you take your original image, you can use a smaller size of it and basically trace it into a silhouette, an SVG file, and then it slowly transitions into the original picture using a CSS transition. And then there's also image primitives, which are probably my favorite type of placeholder, but they are a little bit complicated. It actually uses the code to create this primitive image. And within the image is using triangles or ellipses or rectangles. It gives a very artistic look, but it's a little bit complicated and not something that I will likely be able to explain very well. So I'll show you Google's image load really quick. We'll just, let's see, let's just search for pumpkins here. And oh, I hope you noticed as that page was trying to load, there were a whole bunch of solid color squares. I'm going to scroll down a bit so you can see them, hopefully. There we go. And if you notice, a lot of them are varying shades of orange or red as placeholders. Okay, and then our original image comes and sits right on top of that space. That's how Google does it. And then we have over here an example of our low quality image placeholder. So it starts out with a tiny thumbnail, uses a CSS transition to bring in the original good quality photo into focus. And then our image SVG trace, we start off with those two colors. And it's, again, we use that CSS transition to slowly bring the original into focus once it's loaded. And our last one, the image primitives. Okay, I don't know if you noticed that. I'm going to bring it back so you can see all of these shapes within the picture. It's not our original picture per se, because it has all of these shapes to make up the placeholder. However, out of all of them, this is the closest to our original picture. It creates a beautiful effect and is very, it definitely enhances the user experience because it is so similar to what our original picture looks like. And then we use that CSS transition again to bring the original into focus. Okay, so that's a basic overview of placeholders. I mentioned inline imaging, so just to kind of give you a little understanding of that, it uses data URIs and it allows you to embed all kinds of objects. In our case, it would be images within your web page. It definitely accelerates the rendering of your placeholder images, but it also increases the size of your HTML. So be aware of that relationship as you use this inline imaging. You need to make sure that you're doing what's best for your website or web page. There are different methods we can use to create a blur effect. Within CSS, there is actually a filter called blur. Nice and simple, and it's very effective. And a lot of times will be used along with JavaScript, which will load your placeholder image and then your original image to sit on top of that placeholder image. There's also an HTML tag called canvas. It has a similar effect. You'll have to use JavaScript again to load the images, and you need to use some CSS styling to allow space for your image, your placeholder, so that it doesn't shift as the image actually loads. I'm not going to go into the canvas tag too much. It requires a bit of work, but I will post a link so that you can look it up if you are interested in learning more about it. But I do have a code pen here for just the CSS blur effect. So we have our low quality image over here in our HTML. Okay, and all we've done is in our CSS, we've taken that image and we have applied a filter to which we have put blur and then specified how much we actually want it to blur the image. So it's pretty straightforward, simple CSS. And then when we add in the JavaScript here, so in our HTML, we have our images, okay? And in our CSS, we have our different classes listed with a little bit of styling. Our placeholder div, we have given it a position of relative. And then the image, the placeholder image, which is our smaller image, we've given it a position of absolute, okay? And then it's going to transition, and it's just a 1 second transition. It's pretty quick, but once our larger image will load, it goes through this transition and it gets rid of that placeholder. Okay, so and down here it shows you that our small image, it's blurred, and this one is 50 pixels. Okay, and then over here in our JavaScript, as soon as that window is loaded, it runs through these functions. First, it will load our small image, then it loads our larger image, and that larger image sits on top of the placeholder image. Okay, so that goes through our blur effects. Okay, really briefly, I wanted to talk about what's called lazy loading. I mentioned it earlier. The basics of lazy loading, it will check, we use our code to check and see if these images are within the viewport, or if they're close enough to the viewport that they need to be loaded. And if so, then it will go ahead and request those images. It will load them. And it has to be, this code has to be repeated every time we scroll or we resize our viewport, because that brings new images within the viewport. This can get really complicated. There's a lot of equations involved with it. And it was a little bit overwhelming. They have a semi-new API. It's actually been out for probably about 3 years now. It's called Intersection Observer. The most recent I could find, it's not supported by Internet Explorer, but all of the other web browsers support it. However, you do have to take that into account when you use this in your code. You need to make sure that you have a backup when this can't be used. But basically what this API does, it acts as a JavaScript object, and it will subscribe to an event that triggers when an image enters the rendered area. It's really a cool API, and I will post some code so that you guys can look at that, how it's used within JavaScript. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll do my best to answer them. And I hope that you guys have learned a little bit about progressive image loading.